The email arrived at 3:17 in the morning. No subject line, no greeting, just a single attachment labeled Operational Cost Adjustment Appendix B. Lena Ward opened it in the dim light of her kitchen, the city still asleep beyond the window. She read slowly, line by line, until her eyes reached the figure at the bottom of the page. $25,000. Deducted. No appeal, no explanation, only one sentence, cold and impersonal, stating that the amount had been withheld due to a violation of facility usage terms. She did not gasp. She did not curse. She simply closed her eyes for a moment, long enough to understand that this was not a mistake. A declaration. The apartment was silent, except for the low hum of the refrigerator. Somewhere outside, a siren passed and faded. Inside, something shifted. Not anger, recognition. They thought she was just a landlord. A name on a contract, a line item on a ledger. They had no idea who they were dealing with. Lena stood and poured herself a glass of water, drank it slowly, then opened the document again. The language was clinical, impersonal, carefully engineered to sound final. Unauthorized use of infrastructure, operational breach, non-compliant activity, the kind of wording designed to shut down questions before they were asked. She had written sentences like these herself, years ago, back when her job was to protect companies from their own arrogance. She had spent over a decade advising corporations on regulatory compliance, watching executives unravel when they realized too late that the fine print mattered more than their ambition. She had written clauses designed to survive scrutiny, to outlast lawsuits, to hold up when everything else collapsed, and now one of those clauses was being used against her, or so they thought. She scrolled to the section marked Clause 14, subsection C. There it was, exactly as she remembered. Restrictions on third-party access, limitations on infrastructure use, explicit language about unauthorized demonstrations and data exposure. The clause they had signed without reading, the clause that now made their position indefensible. Outside, the city was beginning to wake. Somewhere across town, the company that had just taken her money was likely celebrating another milestone, another funding rumor, another glowing headline. Their founder was probably smiling for a camera, selling the future with polished confidence. They had no idea that they had just stepped into a situation they could not talk their way out of. Lena closed the laptop and stood by the window, watching the reflection of her own face in the glass, calm, focused, awake in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. She was not angry. She was precise. This was not about revenge. It was about correction, about reminding people that rules exist for a reason and that some of them are written by those who never need to raise their voice. They had mistaken her silence for weakness, and in doing so, they had handed her everything she needed. The elevator doors closed behind her with a dull, hollow sound, as if the building itself had swallowed a secret. The fluorescent lights flickered once, then steadied. She stood still, her phone still in her hand, the message frozen on the screen. An email sent at 3:17 in the morning. No greeting, no explanation. Just a cold attachment titled Operational Cost Adjustment Appendix B. Lena read it again, slowly, line by line, until her eyes reached the figure at the bottom. $25,000. Deducted. No appeal. No discussion. Just a sterile line stating that the amount had been withheld due to a violation of facility usage terms. She did not gasp. She did not swear. She simply closed her eyes for a moment, long enough to recognize what this truly was. Not an error. Not a misunderstanding. A declaration. The apartment was silent except for the low hum of electricity outside. The city slept, unaware. Inside, something had shifted. Not anger. Something colder. Something sharper. They thought she was just a landlord, a name on a lease, a background figure who signed paperwork and stayed out of the way. They had no idea who they were dealing with. She walked to the counter, poured herself a glass of water, and drank slowly. The email still glowed on the screen behind her. Phrases like unauthorized usage and operational breach stared back with bureaucratic indifference. Language designed to sound final, to discourage questions. Language she had once written herself. Years ago, she had been the one corporations called when things went wrong. When compliance failed, when systems cracked, she had written the clauses others skimmed past. She had watched executives crumble when those same clauses turned against them. And now someone had tried to use that machinery on her. She opened the contract again, not to check it, but to confirm what she already knew. Clause 14, subsection C, restrictions on third-party access, limits on infrastructure use, explicit boundaries they had crossed without hesitation. The evidence was there, quiet and absolute. Outside, the city was waking up. Somewhere across town, the company that had just taken her money was probably celebrating another milestone, another round of praise, another article calling them innovators. Their founder would be smiling for a camera, confident and untouchable. They had no idea how exposed they were. She closed the laptop and stood by the window, watching her reflection merge with the waking skyline. Her face was calm, focused. There was no anger in it, only clarity. This was not about revenge. It was about correction. They had mistaken silence for weakness. They had assumed compliance meant submission. And in doing so, they had stepped directly into the framework she had built with precision and patience. She exhaled slowly. The decision had already been made, not in anger, but in certainty. She would not argue. She would not plead. She would simply let the process unfold exactly as designed. Outside, the city began to move, unaware that something had already shifted beneath its feet. The balance had changed. The rules were still the same, but now they belonged to her. She closed the laptop. The room fell quiet again. Not the quiet of an ending, but the kind that comes just before something irreversible begins. The morning began with a call no one expected. The phone rang through the quiet apartment, sharp and insistent, cutting through the stillness. She looked at the screen for a moment before answering. The voice on the other end was careful, polite, rehearsed. A legal representative, speaking in a measured tone, explaining that there had been a misunderstanding, that certain matters needed clarification, that perhaps things had escalated too quickly. She did not respond right away. She let the silence stretch, long enough for discomfort to settle on the other end of the line. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, steady, almost gentle. She said she understood perfectly. There was no confusion, no mistake. The line went quiet. In that pause, she could feel the shift, the moment when control quietly slipped from one hand to another. She ended the call without ceremony. No farewell, no reassurance. Across the city, the office where that call had originated felt suddenly smaller. Conversations lowered, eyes avoided one another. The confidence that had filled the room hours earlier thinned into unease. Someone began scrolling through documents again, faster this time, searching for reassurance in clauses they had skimmed months before. Another checked timestamps, hoping to find a loophole. They were no longer speaking in certainties, but in questions. Meanwhile, she sat at her desk, sunlight spilling across the surface, illuminating neat stacks of documents laid out with intention. She moved through them slowly, not searching, but confirming. Each page aligned with the next, every detail fitting into a pattern she had recognized long ago. There was no satisfaction in this, only clarity. She had seen this pattern many times before. Organizations mistaking confidence for invulnerability, leaders confusing momentum with immunity. They believed speed could outrun consequence. She knew better. As the afternoon passed, messages began to circulate. Internal discussions grew urgent. Meetings were scheduled and rescheduled. Someone suggested reaching out again, softer this time. Someone else warned against provoking her further. The name that had once carried little weight now hung heavily in every conversation. She remained silent, not out of indifference, but precision. Silence, she knew, could be louder than accusation. By evening, the city glowed under a blanket of lights. From her window, she watched traffic move in slow streams, each car unaware of the quiet shift taking place above them. She felt no triumph, no anger. Only the calm certainty that comes when events begin to unfold exactly as expected. They had believed this was a negotiation. They had mistaken patience for weakness. What they did not understand was that the moment they crossed the line, the outcome had already been decided. She closed her laptop gently. Somewhere, far away, the machinery of consequence had begun to turn. The first crack appeared not in a document or an email, but in the voice of a man who had stopped believing his own confidence. He spoke carefully, choosing words that sounded reasonable, almost apologetic, yet every syllable carried the weight of fear. The call reached her just after sunrise. She listened without interruption, her face calm, her posture still, as if the sound itself could not reach her. He spoke of misunderstandings, of internal reviews, of how things had been taken out of context. He spoke of cooperation, of resolution, of moving forward. He spoke as someone who had realized, far too late, that the ground beneath him was not as solid as he had believed. She did not interrupt him. She did not correct him. She let him speak until his voice thinned and the silence between his words grew longer than the words themselves. When he finished, she thanked him for the call and said nothing more. The line went dead. The decision had already been made long before he dialed her number. In the quiet that followed, she stood by the window and watched the morning stretch across the city. Light crept between buildings, touching windows, revealing movement. The world continued, unaware that something had shifted beneath its surface. She felt no triumph, only clarity. Years earlier, she had learned the power of observation. She had learned that authority rarely announced itself. It hid in contracts, in clauses no one read, in assumptions people made because they were in a hurry. She had learned that the loudest voices often belonged to those with the weakest footing. That lesson had cost her time, patience, and more nights than she cared to remember. But it had also given her precision. Now that precision was at work. She moved through her apartment with quiet intent, opening folders, reviewing timelines, confirming details she already knew by heart. Each document reinforced the same truth. They had crossed lines they never bothered to see. They had treated access as ownership and convenience as permission. In their confidence, they had left a trail so clear it bordered on careless. Across the city, tension thickened. Meetings were called. Voices rose and fell behind closed doors. Advisors disagreed. Some urged silence. Others urged confrontation. A few, the ones who understood the depth of the problem, said nothing at all. They knew the moment for argument had already passed. In her apartment, the air remained still. She sat at her desk, hands folded, gaze steady. The power she held was not loud or dramatic. It did not demand attention. It waited. It had been waiting all along. She thought briefly of how she must appear to them. A minor player, a formality, someone to be managed. It almost made her smile. The truth was simpler and far more dangerous. She had never needed to raise her voice because the system itself spoke for her. When the message finally arrived, confirming that formal proceedings were being prepared, she read it once and set the device aside. No reaction showed on her face. There was nothing left to decide. The path forward had already been laid. Outside, the city moved on, unaware that a quiet line had been crossed and could not be uncrossed. In offices and conference rooms, people would soon begin to realize that their assumptions had betrayed them. The power they thought they held had always belonged elsewhere. She remained still, composed, almost serene, not triumphant, not angry, simply resolved. The kind of calm that comes when the outcome is no longer in doubt. The notification sound cut through the quiet room like a blade against glass. It was sharp, deliberate, impossible to ignore. She glanced at the screen and already knew what it would be before reading a single word. The subject line was formal, restrained, carefully written, a notice, a response, a move made by people who believed they still had control. She did not open it immediately. Instead, she stood by the window, watching the city breathe below her. Cars moved in steady lines, lights flickered on and off, unaware that somewhere above them a balance had just shifted. The message could wait. She already understood what it would say. It was never about the words. It was about timing. When she finally opened the email, her expression did not change. The language was polished, almost apologetic. They spoke of misunderstandings, of internal reviews, of a desire to resolve matters constructively. The tone was cautious, carefully neutral, crafted by people who had begun to realize they were no longer in control of the narrative. She read every line, not for information, but for confirmation. They were afraid now. Not panicked, but unsettled. That was enough. She set the phone down and walked toward the window, letting the light wash over her face. Outside, the city moved on as if nothing had changed. People crossed streets, cars stopped at intersections, lives continued in neat parallel lines. None of them knew that a quiet shift had already occurred, that the balance of power had tilted without noise or spectacle. Her thoughts moved with precision. She did not feel anger or satisfaction, only clarity. the kind that comes when uncertainty dissolves and the path ahead becomes inevitable. She had seen this pattern before, in boardrooms and legal chambers, in moments when those accustomed to control realized too late that they no longer held it. Across the city, in a glass-walled conference room, tension thickened the air. Voices rose, then fell. Papers were shuffled, phones checked, glances exchanged. Someone suggested caution, someone else argued for delay, another insisted everything could still be contained. But beneath the discussion lay a shared awareness that something irreversible had already begun. Back in her apartment, she moved with quiet purpose. She opened a folder she had prepared long before this moment, its contents arranged with care and foresight. Every document told the same story from a different angle. Together, they formed a picture impossible to dismiss. She did not feel triumph as she reviewed them, only certainty. She understood now that power rarely announces itself. It settles silently, like dust, until the weight becomes undeniable. Those who mistake calm for weakness often do so at their own expense. She had never needed to raise her voice. She had only needed to wait. As night settled over the city, she closed the folder and placed it aside. The room grew still. Outside, lights continued to flicker, traffic flowed, conversations carried on, unaware that something fundamental had shifted. The moment had passed, and with it any chance of turning back. The outcome was no longer in question. The story was already moving toward its inevitable conclusion. The call came just as the city was settling into the early hours of the afternoon, when the light was sharp enough to reveal everything, but still soft enough to hide intentions. She recognized the number instantly. This time she answered without hesitation. On the other end, a man spoke carefully, his voice controlled yet strained, each word chosen as if walking across thin ice. He spoke of misunderstandings, of context, of decisions made under pressure. He spoke quickly, as though speed might outrun consequence. She listened without interrupting. Her silence was deliberate, steady, and unsettling. When he finally paused, waiting for reassurance or resistance, she replied calmly, almost gently. She told him she understood, that everything he said had been heard, that the matter was already in motion. Her tone carried no accusation, no threat, only certainty. The line went quiet. What followed was not an argument, but the sound of realization settling in. She ended the call without ceremony. No farewell, no warning, just a clean end. Outside, daylight stretched across the city, bright and indifferent. She stood by the window, feeling the weight of the moment without drama or fear. This was not anger. This was inevitability. Across the city, tension began to ripple through rooms that had once felt untouchable. Conversations shifted in tone. Meetings were called and canceled in quick succession. Voices lowered. Documents were reviewed again and again, as if repetition might change their meaning. The certainty that once filled those rooms was quietly draining away. She, meanwhile, moved with calm precision. She sat at her desk, opening folders she had prepared long before this day. Each document lay exactly where it belonged, each timestamp a quiet witness. She did not rush. There was no need. The truth had a weight of its own. Those on the other side felt it too. They felt it in the hesitation before speaking, in the way eyes avoided one another, in the sudden awareness that the ground beneath them was no longer solid. What had once seemed manageable now appeared irreversible. As evening fell, the city outside continued its rhythm, unaware of the shift that had taken place within its walls. Lights turned on. Traffic flowed. Life moved forward. Inside, she sat in stillness, knowing that the moment had already passed. The outcome was no longer in question. The process had begun, and nothing now could stop it. The afternoon unfolded quietly, yet something in the air had shifted. The news spread not with noise, but with weight, like a fracture moving beneath the surface. A message had been forwarded, an internal notice that carried more consequence than it appeared to on the surface. It was enough to unsettle those who read it, enough to make them pause. Somewhere in the city, a room grew tense as the realization settled in that control was slipping away. She stood alone in her apartment, the light from the window tracing the edges of the room. Her expression was calm, almost distant. She had known this moment would come. The message had not surprised her. It confirmed what she already understood. There was no rush in her movements, no urgency in her breath. Everything was unfolding exactly as it should. Across the city, conversations grew strained, voices lowered, words were chosen carefully. People who once spoke with certainty now hesitated, revisiting decisions they had been so confident in only days before. Meetings stretched longer than planned. Silence filled the spaces between sentences. The certainty that once bound them together had begun to crack. She felt none of their panic. She sat still, watching the city beyond the glass as afternoon light shifted toward evening. The hum of distant traffic formed a steady backdrop. In her mind, everything aligned with quiet precision. This was not chaos. It was consequence. They were beginning to understand that the ground beneath them had shifted, that what they assumed was stable had been built on fragile assumptions, and now those assumptions were giving way, piece by piece. She had not forced this moment. She had only allowed it to arrive. In the conference rooms across the city, unease thickened the air. Discussions circled without resolution. Faces tightened. The certainty that once defined them began to erode. No one spoke of her directly, but her presence lingered in every pause, in every unfinished sentence. She remained where she was, unmoved, watching the light fade from the skyline. There was no triumph in her expression, no sense of victory, only clarity. The kind that comes when events finally align with truth, the kind that does not need to announce itself. As night settled in, the city continued to glow, unaware that something fundamental had shifted beneath its surface. The outcome was no longer in question. The path forward had already been set, quietly, decisively, and without the need for another word. The door closed behind her with a soft sound that barely carried through the room, yet it marked the moment everything shifted. Something had been set in motion, quietly and without spectacle. She moved forward without hesitation, her steps steady, her posture composed, as if the outcome had already been written. There was no need to look back. Everything that needed to be said had already been said in silence. Across the city, unease began to ripple through rooms that once felt untouchable. Meetings were called and canceled in the same breath. Voices lowered, confidence thinned. People who once spoke with certainty now measured every word. They sensed it before they could name it. Something had slipped beyond their control, something they could no longer negotiate or contain. The air felt heavier, charged with a realization they were not ready to face. She, meanwhile, stood by the window, watching the light shift across the buildings. There was no urgency in her movements, no trace of triumph, only calm awareness. She had seen this moment coming long before anyone else noticed the signs. The pieces had aligned quietly, one by one, until the pattern was unmistakable. What was unfolding now was not revenge. It was consequence. In distant offices, conversations fractured, voices overlapped, then fell silent. Documents were reread, messages reconsidered, strategies abandoned. The certainty that once filled those rooms had drained away, replaced by the heavy understanding that something irreversible had begun. The power they thought they held was slipping, not through force, but through exposure. She remained still as evening settled in, watching the light fade from the skyline. There was no triumph in her expression, no sense of victory, only clarity, the kind that comes when events finally align with truth, the kind that does not need to announce itself. As night settled over the city, she felt no rush, no need to act. The work was already done. The outcome was set, not by action, but by consequence, and nothing could turn it back. The evening arrived quietly, yet it carried a weight that pressed gently against the air. The room was lit, but the light seemed to hesitate, as if aware that something had shifted. She stood still, listening to the silence settle around her. Nothing dramatic had happened, yet everything had changed. The moment did not announce itself. It simply arrived, steady and unavoidable. Somewhere else, doors were closing. Conversations that once flowed easily now stopped mid-sentence. Calls were cut short. Meetings ended early. The people involved did not need explanations. They could feel it in the tension of their own voices, in the way certainty had begun to erode beneath their words. Something they once controlled had moved beyond reach. She remained where she was, her presence calm, almost still. She did not need to act. The shift had already occurred. What was unfolding now was only the consequence. She had seen this pattern before, in other rooms, with other faces. It always began the same way. Confidence gave way to doubt. Authority softened into hesitation. The realization arrived quietly, but left no room for denial. Across the city, decisions were being reconsidered, documents reread, calls placed and unanswered. The sense of control that once filled those rooms now slipped through their fingers like sand. They searched for reassurance, for a way to restore balance, but found only the echo of their own uncertainty. She felt no triumph in this. There was no satisfaction in watching others falter. What she felt was clarity, the kind that comes when events align with truth. She had not forced this moment. She had simply allowed it to unfold. That was the difference. That was the power. As evening deepened, the city lights began to glow one by one. From her window, the world appeared unchanged, yet she knew something essential had shifted. A quiet realignment, invisible but undeniable. She stood still, composed and certain, knowing there was nothing more she needed to do. The outcome was already in motion, and it would unfold without further effort on her part. The door closed behind her with a soft sound, barely audible, yet heavy enough to mark the end of something irreversible. The room fell still. No voices, no movement, just the quiet weight of a moment settling into place. She did not turn back. There was no need. Everything that needed to happen had already begun. Somewhere else, in rooms filled with light and tension, the atmosphere shifted. Conversations stalled mid-sentence. People who had once spoken with certainty now hesitated, their confidence thinning with every passing second. Documents were reviewed again and again, as if repetition might undo what had already been set in motion. The realization crept in slowly, then all at once. Something had changed, and it was beyond their control. She stood alone by the window, watching the city breathe beneath her. The lights below flickered like distant signals, indifferent to the quiet turning of events above. Her expression held no triumph, no satisfaction, only clarity. She had not forced this moment. She had simply allowed it to arrive. Elsewhere, voices rose and fell in uneasy rooms. Meetings stretched on without direction. Words lost their weight. Decisions were postponed, then abandoned. The confidence that once filled those spaces drained away, replaced by uncertainty and restraint. They were beginning to understand that what they faced could not be negotiated or delayed. She remained still, her reflection faint in the glass. There was no need for haste, no need for celebration. This was not a victory to be declared. It was the quiet completion of something long in motion, a conclusion that did not require acknowledgement to be real. Outside, the city continued its rhythm, lights glowed, cars moved, lives unfolded without pause. And yet, beneath the ordinary flow of things, something fundamental had shifted. A balance had tipped, a line had been crossed. She turned from the window, the room dim behind her. There was nothing left to say, nothing left to do. What had begun in silence had reached its end the same way, calm. Certain. Unavoidable. The room fell into a silence, so complete it felt almost physical. Nothing moved, nothing sounded, and yet everything had shifted. She stood there unmoving, as if the space itself were holding its breath around her. There was no need to look back, no need to confirm what had already happened. The moment had passed, and with it, the last thread tying her to what came before. Somewhere else, far from her stillness, unease spread quietly. Conversations faltered, confident voices softened. Decisions that once came easily now stalled beneath their own weight. People who had believed themselves untouchable began to sense the ground slipping beneath their feet, though none could quite name why. Something fundamental had changed, and no amount of authority or urgency could reverse it. She remained still, standing by the window as the city moved beyond her. Lights flickered on one by one, unaware of the shift that had already taken place. She felt no triumph, no surge of victory. What filled her instead was a calm certainty, the kind that arrives only when there is nothing left to prove. She had not forced this moment, she had simply allowed it to arrive. Elsewhere, confusion took hold. Meetings were called, voices lowered, decisions delayed. The confidence that once filled those rooms drained away, replaced by hesitation and doubt. They searched for explanations, for someone to blame, for a way to reclaim control, but the structure they relied on had already fractured. The realization came too late. She watched the city breathe beneath the fading light. Every window, every moving car, every distant sound carried on, unaware of the shift that had just occurred. And yet it had happened quietly, completely, The kind of change that leaves no visible mark but alters everything that follows. There was no triumph in her expression, no desire for recognition. What she felt was resolution, a calm acceptance of what had come to pass. She had not forced it, she had allowed it to unfold. As night settled in, the room darkened around her. She did not turn on the lights, she did not need to. The path ahead was already clear. What remained was not an ending, but the beginning of something irreversible. As the story settles and the silence lingers, remember this moment is not just an ending, it is an invitation. Every choice you witnessed, every quiet shift of power, every unspoken decision was built on awareness, patience, and the courage to see what others refuse to see. This story is not about one person standing above the rest. It is about understanding that influence does not always announce itself. Sometimes it waits, sometimes it watches, and sometimes it moves only when the time is right. If this story resonated with you, if it reminded you of moments where silence spoke louder than noise or restraint carried more weight than force, then you already understand its message. Power is not always loud, strength is not always visible, and transformation rarely arrives with applause. If you want to continue exploring stories like this, stories about quiet authority, strategic patience, and unseen strength, stay with us. Like this video if it spoke to you. Share it with someone who understands the value of subtle power. Subscribe to follow more stories where control is earned, not claimed, and where silence can be louder than any shout. The story does not end here. It only shifts into its next phase, and if you are paying attention, you will recognize it when it arrives.